I think the title of the lecture series, Confluence, and my participation in this in that title is appropriate given the work that I do and the people I try to involve myself with. And I hope that the lecture tonight brings some clarity to work for my work for the students that I have here in the building, as well as for myself, as I always think of these things as ongoing experiments. So the one difficulty I did have in preparing for tonight's lecture was that we've been on this journey before together, many of you, so it's kind of like a third date. And I've never been terribly successful socially, so I consulted the best resources I knew and decided to gain any type of advice I could in advance of this evening. So the advice I was given that I found about the third date is that, you know, different from your first date where it's all about introductions and awkwardness, your second date maybe is, you know, you tell your best stories and your life history. The third date's really where you tend to go a little bit deeper and maybe give away a little bit more. So I figured I'd start the evening with probably my deepest and proudest secret, which is my expansive collection of Bruce Springsteen bootlegs. I have roughly 75 concerts on CD, and I've converted them to iTunes, and I have them with me at all times in my phone. So I think I was at one of Ashley's end of the quarter parties, and we were comparing, or I shouldn't say we, I should say Jeff Kipnis and Michael Meredith were comparing collections of music, and I didn't have anything that like lived up to the kind of interest level of Bob Somel's collection of porn themes, but I do feel like Springsteen at least is a bit more culturally significant and something that I can at least feel comfortable showing people in the public. So that's that. And I thought, okay, now this is going to be great because at this point everybody will be comfortable, I'll be comfortable, you'll be comfortable. And then this morning I had probably the most uncomfortable experience of my life. I had a dream involving my dog, Jeff Kipnis, and Jack Nasser. And it involved basically, and I really wasn't sure if I was awake or still asleep at the time. I was out on a walk in the middle of the night, as I often am with my dog, and I turned the corner right by Scully's where I live, and out stumbled Jeff and Jack. And they were very merry and singing and, you know, having a very good time together. And I thought, this is either my subconscious telling me to relax about tonight or some type of bizarre residue of our committee work over the last few weeks. So that said, I will finally get to my presentation tonight. Everybody comfortable? All right, good. So the title of my office, if you can call it that, and of tonight's lecture is Influx, which is kind of something that we've stumbled upon and have defined and redefined at various points. At one point, it was just a joke between Karen and I that we never did work in the same place, we never did work in the same way, we never did work with the same people. But more and more, I really think of it as in that way, it was always influx, like we were changing. But now I'm really thinking about it as influx, or a arrival and concentration of something. And the work that I'm going to show tonight, I think, is basically just a timeline of that. So I look at the landscape very large, at a very large scale for most things conceptually. I sometimes try to operate at that scale, but I'm always kind of intimidated by what that landscape is. I'm intimidated by the impacts that we have on it, and to some degree our powerlessness to kind of respond to it. We're kind of at its mercy in many ways, whether naturally or infrastructurally. And issues that are kind of central to the last few years of climate change and dramatics of weather have kind of always brought this to my attention, and I've never completely felt totally comfortable about how to respond to that. The issues are dramatic, they're they're large, they're difficult to deal with, and they can feel monumental. While in graduate school, I was really starting to define my interaction and my curiosity about this larger landscape just with the concern of horizontal growth of the city and how those issues were being addressed or failed to be addressed by design professionals. And it's a no less intimidating issue when you begin to think about that these are issues that we're dealing with as a well-developed nation, and we are such a small percentage of the world, and such a larger percentage is going to have to go through some of the same experiences that we have, and hopefully they don't make the same mistakes. Much of my research when I got here to the school was focused on really trying to frame that large landscape for myself and think about ways to engage it, thinking about ways to alter it. But at the same time, it was still dealing with that idea of everything around us was kind of weird and too big of a challenge, kind of like when you watch weekends of To Catch a Predator and you think everybody on the internet must be some kind of psychopath and everybody driving a van is somebody to steer clear of. So how do we look at a landscape and not feel that intimidation? This is an image demonstrating too, I think, the scale of the built landscape. So it's somewhat a positive and somewhat a negative. The built landscape or the design landscape here represented as just lawn. It's both a representation of how little influence designers have had, but also how much their impact has. Well, I guess that's just a double-sided thing. But the idea, and I think the comfort level that comes from all of these issues is that they're all demonstrations of change in a landscape, and that trying to consider a landscape as a fixed thing and actually understand it completely is kind of a losing battle, and that's something that I'm kind of coming to terms with in my design work as well as in my research. But the issues aren't something that we can simply turn a blind eye to. We obviously have to deal with them. The questions of how we deal with them, I think, are things we need to look anew at. There's plenty of examples of starting to do that, starting to consider the way that we've dealt with things in the past and how we could move through into the future. But we haven't yet really seen that same application in landscape. Landscape has been on a more consistent trajectory. The first project I'm going to show tonight is my design entry for Envisioning Gateway. It was a competition sponsored by the Van Allen Institute a few years back, and I was still, at this point, considering the influence of this large landscape, its capacity, and design's capacity to alter it. The entry focused on quantifying biomass on a global scale, thinking about the landscapes of our national parks and their ability to impact the larger national and/or global landscape, as well as the immediate landscape of New York City and the 5 boroughs. The ability to think about national parks as a resource as opposed to just a natural amenity. The proposal involved having a financial partnership between the National Park Service and the cities, where a tax would be the way to facilitate greening parts of the city, as well as a way to have the site service as a research laboratory for how to transplant large-scale landscapes in a kind of response to emergency conditions seen throughout the globe. I haven't had an image that I didn't include of this, but of us dropping wetlands on Iraq, but it didn't really seem to fit. But I guess the challenge, I guess the response I have to that series of research and that moment in my development was really one based out of kind of a moment of fear for the last 8 years about, are we adequate? Do we have the intelligence to respond to something? Are we making the right decisions, or are we going in a direction that isn't really so great? So, moment of optimism, moment to step back from the work, look at it again. Springsteen shows up, gives great insight, and we can all move forward in a happy-go-lucky way. And I think for me at the school, these lectures are always kind of opportunities to see other people's response to these types of questions. And one of the most significant, I think, in the last few years has been Bruce Mao's visit, both during the ecology seminar and his lecture over at the Wexner Center. And what I think is really significant about the massive change effort is that it, asks the question, and an important one. But from a design perspective, it still feels like it has more potential and more inspiration for the general public than it does necessarily for the design community, because what it engages isn't necessarily the material of landscape or the material of architecture specifically. It does obviously point out, though, that there are other smart people in the world, and they're coming up with really good responses to the issues that I was dealing with early on. And I think the response for myself was to question, how can landscape be that smart? On a couple of occasions, I've made public statements about that there aren't enough smart landscape architects and that there aren't enough smart designers and that type of thing. It's kind of an anecdote is always the episode of Seinfeld where the kid who's going to get the scholarship wants to be an architect, and then he changes his mind. He wants to be a city planner, and they laugh about how everybody, the dumbest guy in the fraternity was the architect, and you can add landscape architect to that. So, what's landscape's capacity for intelligent design choices, intelligent decision making, and intelligent forward thought? I think the example of Central Park is one of the more lasting examples of a landscape that is forward thinking. We can critique it in a lot of different ways, but I think it certainly does have that capacity. So how do we move forward? These aren't bad web images. They're things that I think we need to understand that are there and then begin to move forward from. And one thing is old white guys. We need to start to understand the lessons that we can take away, but not obsess about just recalling the glory days of designers past and methodologies of yore. As well, we need to, I think, question the simple point, counterpoint, or as I think John has said in the past on some reviews, the stewardship of the wish list responsive design. Something that seems tangible, seems very direct, seems very responsible. I think that's something we should question. For myself, I've always been around, the question that I've kind of challenged the most is this basic assumption that density is good, that density in all forms is going to be a way that we can respond to the issues of our larger landscape. And this was a series of diagrams I did for an incomplete entry into the Columbus Rewired competition. And it takes the 16 most populous cities in the country and looks at their existing population against their existing land use, projected population, and looks at actually the differences between the demands that are going to be placed on a city like New York or LA and our conditions here in Columbus. The only two cities in this list that don't actually have a land capacity that exceed, or doesn't have population pressures that exceed their current land holdings are Indianapolis and Columbus. So how do we look at a landscape for capacity and not necessarily just a response of a knee-jerk reaction? Questioning design problems is something I do in competitions. This is a competition that Karen and I worked on for the Cape Wind project in Nantucket Sound. The proposal from the competition committee was to deal with the proposed wind farm that's in Nantucket Sound, identified because of its shallow depths and high wind currents. Karen and I, though, were very familiar with this landscape, so we had a critical perspective of it. This is our probably favorite place in Boston. It's Deer Island. It's a water treatment facility and park in combination with one another. So we started really looking at the Boston Harbor waterfront as an example of a landscape that is very comfortably both a natural amenity and also a working element. The areas highlighted here are infrastructure in red, and then recreational sites in blue. So the issue with the Cape Wind proposal is the array of wind turbines. This has now since been approved through all the, I don't want to say all, but most all the environmental impact reports, and it looks like it's going to go forward. But at the time, it was fairly controversial because of the number of people in the area that would have a visual impact on their viewshed. The array that we proposed actually took the existing grid system and arranged it in a large circle that we thought would reorganize the wind turbines into something that was democratic from any perspective. Whether you looked at it from north, south, east, or west, the perspective was always going to be the same. In doing that, we did a few really nice things. We were able to increase the productivity of the wind farm and also demonstrate how this type of infrastructure could be a positive element within the working landscape. The competition entry also focused on the landscape itself and brought in elements of productivity and active recreation and put all those things in very close proximity to one another. That's my dog. Kind of coming back to this idea, though, of challenging the directions that we assume or that are developing, I think that there is room, too, for where we are to challenge that in landscape. The impact of the work of firms like James Corner's field operations, Stoss Landscape Urbanism, I think are really significant. They, I think, are a great population of very smart people in landscape. I think that the dialogue that they've stimulated between landscape architecture and planning is really significant, but there are things for us to question and for me to question independently for my own work. The kind of idea of landscape urbanism is not so well defined, but landscape has never been so well defined either, so I don't really have an issue with that. But two basic ideas about it that I think are pretty easily understood is that you're dealing with the landscape's presence in cities, in an urban setting, or you're dealing with landscapes as a way to, with the landscape as a way to understand cities, understanding them from a systems perspective, understanding their organization, which can be very complex, through the language and mechanisms of landscape. Next slide. But I also tend to want to find something that is not just anecdotal to that condition, but something that I can actually move forward with. And I think it's an attention to site that I really developed through my undergraduate work, which was all larger scale regional planning and land management, as well as the smaller scale design work professionally, to look at site as a way to take information from it, no matter what scale, and think about the implications of that and how you respond to that. Not that you're looking necessarily for a condition that leads you to a singular response, but one that opens up the capacity, again, of landscape. An experience that I had last year, which I think was certainly enjoyed more by me than by Tom, was the seminar series that we have here for our graduate students and upper-level undergrads, the Glimpture series. And Tom Leader was here last spring, and we had a lot of conversations, and a lot of the time was spent in discussion around the series of models that he did while in Rome as a fellow of the American Academy. And the models all take, they take, I think, a 200-year snapshot of the evolution of Rome and look how the city has actually built and rebuilt itself, reusing foundations and taking structural elements from times past and moving forward. From a landscape perspective, for me, though, this was a bit of an interesting thing because it was really rich and it seemed like it had a lot of potential, but I didn't know how it applied to a landscape that was as broad as the American landscape and as quickly developing as the urban suburban landscape. So I started to look at landscape from this infrastructural perspective, wanting that type of structure to exist in the landscape. I wanted it to be evident. I wanted it to be possible. And that led me to kind of considering border conditions literally, between the border between the US and Mexico and the possibilities of that. And in preparation for this lecture, I started to go back through a series of projects that I did as a graduate student, and this is where I'm not so sure that the lecture is the best thing, because I don't know if you ever show your student work as a faculty member, but I'll take a shot. This was actually a slide that I did of the Eames film, The Powers of 10, and at one point, and in the earliest work, I really think my understanding and my interest in landscape borders was about getting a handle again on scale. This is a satellite image of Mexico City where I did a studio in my second year in graduate school. Actually, it might have been the spring of my first year. But anyway, the idea of looking at the urban landscape and utilizing borders was to me at this point, like I say, all about trying to understand and give legibility to a landscape of such scale. This is a city at the time of almost 20 million people. The proposal, which I won't really show, was kind of based on this idea that there were already very strong elements within the city that were structuring how things were developing, and they were all infrastructural in nature. You see, I was looking at kind of the basic standard things of community organizations and neighborhood definition, even at this large city scale, and how that was establishing borders. And the way that it structured itself was very direct. It was very purposeful and obvious. It didn't seem to have anything to do with the landscape itself. This was actually out on the lake bed where residents have been, they basically are able to squat on a property for a period of time, and then it becomes theirs legally, at which time they get some degree of utility services. Also looking at land use and how it was shifting and what the things were in the landscape that were organizing it. And it still, again, came back to these border conditions here between the edge of an urban development and the lake bed itself, separated only by a drainage channel which leads out of the city. This is probably a 25-foot wide open sewer. A good border, if you're trying to find borders. But still, again, it didn't really seem to be of the landscape. And it wasn't until looking at the hydrology of the city that I began to understand really the significance of the potential of those landscape elements to structure things moving forward. Now, these were clearly manipulated in the drainage of Mexico City, but the thing that, in looking back at it now, I start really to think about the potentials of this border where you see infrastructure, site hydrology, all coming together, and there's got to be an urban response to, or I should say a cultural response to those lines. But this still seemed to be about avoiding things. The next studio that I had was focused on the Back Bay Fens and the Emerald Necklace in Boston. The proposal that I put forward had really processing, again, a boundary condition that was kind of not necessarily between two things, but a boundary that was set up to receive things, and somehow the idea that it would knit things together, and I thought that had quite a bit more potential. Those images that are really small up here, basically, just take a look at the conditions along the Muddy River, two areas where you get what I call dams, where the flow of the water is inhibited in some means, and then the conditions behind that dam are changed, and it's basically large fields of Phragmites that have clogged that waterway. And then the conditions of actually having artificial ground or capped conditions on the waterway itself, where the visibility of the water goes away and the city rides atop it. And those kind of conditions in this border, different than the others, I think was about getting at a way to understand the influence of the city context around it, and also how to manage disturbance. The landscape there was it was very stressed by inundations of storm water, abuse by recreational uses and that type of thing. And this was just a series of photograph models that I did to kind of give myself this was about hydrology, but give myself a logic to how to understand how to control the water as a large part of the disturbance on this site. So basically what you see here from the upper left is a system with no structure to it, no defense mechanism, which is then interrupted by a large impact, and then the system gets completely broken down. Versus as you go across, you start to actually add some resistance, some durability to that system, and progressively you see that the same impact here is diffused in some way. Now, I'm reserving the right to not show you the final presentation of that, but I think conceptually that's where it's grounded in the project tonight. So I think that's the Peter Eisenman thing is like, don't ask me about the concepts of my work related on the end product, and I'm going to use that same license here. So if there's something legible coming out of this kind of reprocessing of my work, it's looking at combining those questions of a landscape's capacity and those conditions of border. And this is a graphic by Roberto Burle Marx, and I think in some ways it's kind of symbolic to me of what a border is by definition, without being anything rigorous or having much capacity. Basically, the elements within it are only able to push another element away. They can never service to be a combination of things. Versus looking at like a painting like a Pollock, where the borders might not be as legible, they can be extracted, and you can actually start to think about a border being a combination of influences, not necessarily a single element where you get one condition sitting next to another. So how this is moving forward for me is through models. I've always kind of involved my students with models. I enjoy doing them. I enjoy thinking about how they're critical, what they say. I enjoy the fact that they take time to make, because you get time to think about all those things. The series of models that I show here are always about disassembling a landscape, looking at the large structure of it. And I think if you have done any of these exercises or just looking at the images, you can start to see some idea that borders could be extracted from this, that there's a structure underlying, maybe not obvious, but underlying, that could be of some value. Whether they be direct physical influences of watershed or broader issues of landscape structure. The series of models that I've started to plan for, hopefully I think the summer is be realistic, was going to look at conditions of subsurface geology and surface topography in a critical way to respond to this question. If the infrastructure that we put in place isn't really the thing that's durable, can we begin to identify a significance to the landscape itself that could service as, to provide us with an attention that maybe the Romans understood. The students that I'm working with this quarter, in partnership with Jason Brabs and Jake Boswell and Deb George in the Earthworks and Planting class combination, utilizes transect to look at the conditions of topography as well as plant materials and soil conditions and urban footprint. And I think the transect is a really nice mechanism for this type of study, And moving forward, I think the application of that is going to engage something that has always been a kind of peripheral interest of mine growing up in this part of the country, which deals with the shrinking cities and how we deal with the reality that our economies are going to change and that type of thing. So maybe the landscape's getting bigger, but the attention is maybe getting a little smaller scale. What this is just a map snapshot of two roadways that I've always been interested in for different reasons. Route 11 is a place where I almost ran out of gas driving back from Boston because it's a strange little road that parallels Route 7. You can see the two. There's 11, and then 7 shows up here. They parallel each other between Lake Erie and Youngstown, and then actually converge near the at the West Virginia border. So as highway systems or local highway systems within this kind of network of shrinking cities, this is a bit of infrastructure that I think is open for reconsideration. The two roadways both end in a similar point of type of infrastructure where materials for the production of steel are delivered by barge and then brought down to Youngstown and surrounding areas by rail. And as I said, these two roadways come together just crossing into the West Virginia border. That line, that statewide line as a boundary, I think is really one that I'm interested in thinking about its capacity, not necessarily how to replace a roadway, but how to think about, again, the way to think about infrastructure and landscape. And there's some great examples, I think, too, of using the convention of transect and section to look at those things. I think that's really what the series of models and our drawings will start to accomplish. A more immediate and maybe more obvious application of this interest is a competition that we're just starting this spring break, which is a really good one if you're interested in doing a competition. I think the requirements are only 4 11 by 17s, so it's something you might be able to do in the time that you have between the winter and spring quarters. But it concerns the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, which is a 4-mile long, is this arrow? There we go. A 4-mile long, 180-foot wide boulevard stretching from a golf course here to the Harlem River. And it's an obvious kind of place to apply this interest in boundaries, to consider the competition is kind of an open-ended infrastructural question about the role of this in the city. So I think it's a nice place to start to experiment. The present roadway was designed to be a large urban boulevard, something that kind of responds to that an older idea of urbanism that is obviously changing. So thinking about how the city is going to impact this thing programmatically is an interest of the competition, and also thinking about how people begin to live in it and its ability to contribute to the city at large, I think, is a significant question when we consider an image that we saw earlier. And that's I wish that were the roadway. That would be like a great thing, but that's the river there. But the idea that to see the impact of something like Central Park stretched throughout the city, I think is a significant one. Yeah, thank you very much.